The air in the pediatric wing of Northwood General Hospital always smelled the same to Mark Jennings. A sterile, antiseptic sharpness layered over the faint, sweet scent of baby powder and something vaguely like fear. It was a smell he had known for 12 years, a smell that had once meant purpose and now mostly meant exhaustion. He ran a hand over his tired face, the rough stubble of a 14-hour shift scratching his palm. The fluorescent lights hummed a monotonous tune, a soundtrack to the quiet suffering and silent victories that played out in these halls every single day. Mark was a good nurse. He was meticulous, compassionate, and had a way with frightened children that other staff members envied. But tonight, the goodness felt like a heavy coat he couldn't take off. His heart, an organ he knew in intricate, clinical detail, felt like a hollow room, its only furniture the dusty memory of a love that had been snatched away too soon. He glanced at the clock. 9:47 p.m. He was late. Again. Lily would be the last one at the hospital's daycare, a tiny island of patients in a sea of empty, colorful chairs. The thought of her small, trusting face propelled him forward, his worn sneakers squeaking softly on the polished linoleum. He pushed through the double doors, the conditioned air of the hallway giving way to the cool, damp embrace of the October night. The city exhaled around him, a weary sigh of distant sirens and the rumble of late-night traffic. Under the sickly orange glow of a parking lot lamp, slumped on a concrete bench, was a boy. He couldn't have been more than 14, a lanky silhouette swallowed by a dark hoodie pulled low over his face. His posture was a study in teenage defiance, a fortress of hunched shoulders and crossed arms. But Mark, whose job it was to see the subtle tells of pain, saw something else. He saw the tremor in the boy's clenched fists, the rigid set of his jaw. This wasn't just defiance. It was a deep, simmering anger that seemed to radiate off him like a cold wave. Mark's first instinct, born of a decade of de-escalating tense situations, was to walk on by. He had his own child to worry about, his own cavern of grief to navigate. He didn't have the energy for someone else's storm. He took a few steps toward the daycare entrance, the image of Lily's waiting face pulling at him. But then he stopped. He thought of his own son, if he'd had one. He thought of what it would be like to be 14, adrift in the world, and so full of a rage you couldn't even name. He remembered Sarah, his late wife, and her boundless, almost reckless empathy. "Everyone is fighting a battle you know nothing about," she used to say, her voice a warm melody he could still hear if he concentrated hard enough. He let out a slow breath, the air misting in front of him, and turned back. He walked toward the bench, his footsteps soft, deliberate. He stopped a few feet away, not wanting to crowd the boy's space. "Rough night?" he asked, his voice gentle. The boy's head snapped up. His face, illuminated by the lamplight, was sharp and intelligent, his dark eyes narrowed with suspicion. He was a handsome black kid, but his features were hardened into a protective mask. "What do you want?" the boy shot back, his voice laced with a bitterness that was jarring from someone so young. It wasn't a question, it was a challenge. Mark held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "Nothing. Just getting off a long shift. You look like you've had one, too." The boy scoffed, a harsh, grating sound. He looked away, pulling the hood further over his eyes as if to erase Mark from his view. "Whatever, man. Just leave me alone." Mark should have left. Every rational part of his brain told him to go get his daughter and retreat to the quiet sanctuary of their small apartment. But Sarah's voice was there again, a gentle whisper in the back of his mind. He looked at the boy's thin frame, the way his hoodie hung off his shoulders. He saw the faint, dark circles under his eyes. He looked hungry. "I was about to grab some food," Mark said, changing tactics. "There's a Burger King just down the street. I'm starving. You eaten?" The boy's silence was his only answer, but Mark saw his jaw work, a subtle, involuntary movement. The mask had a crack in it. "Look, I'm not a cop. I'm not a social worker. I'm just a guy who knows what it's like to feel like the world is ending," Mark said, his tone even and calm. "And I also know that it feels slightly less like it's ending on a full stomach. My treat. No strings attached." Jamal looked at the man. He was just a guy, a white guy in faded blue scrubs with tired eyes and a kind of worn-down gentleness about him. He wasn't threatening. He wasn't trying to fix him or preach at him. He was just offering. The hunger, a dull ache he'd been ignoring for hours, suddenly sharpened into a painful knot. He hadn't eaten since lunch, too angry to face his mother, too proud to admit he needed anything. "Why?" Jamal asked, the single word laced with a lifetime of distrust. Mark offered a small, weary smile. "Because my wife always said that a little bit of kindness costs nothing, but its value is infinite. And because I'm guessing you could probably use a Whopper right about now." He didn't wait for an answer. "You stay here. I'll be right back. Double Whopper with cheese?" Jamal was so stunned by the specificity, by the casual assumption of his order, that he just nodded, a barely perceptible dip of his chin. Mark turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the quiet lot. Jamal watched him go, a strange mix of suspicion and a feeling he couldn't name stirring in his chest. A few minutes later, Mark returned, a paper bag in his hand that smelled of salt and grease and uncomplicated comfort. He placed it on the bench, a careful distance from Jamal's leg. Inside was a double Whopper with cheese, a large fries, and a Coke. "There you go," Mark said. "Hope it helps a little." He didn't linger. He didn't ask for a thank you. He just gave the boy a small nod. "Have a good night," he said, and turned to finally go get his daughter. As he walked toward the daycare, he felt a strange lightness. It wasn't happiness, not yet, but it was the absence of some of the weight. For a few minutes, he had stepped outside of his own pain to notice someone else's. From her corner office on the 10th floor, the one with the sprawling, panoramic view of the city lights, Dr. Alana Hayes watched the tiny scene unfold. She had been on the phone, a tense, clipped conversation with the head of the hospital board, but a movement in the parking lot below had caught her eye. She saw the boy in the hoodie, her boy, her brilliant, broken-hearted Jamal, and she saw the man in scrubs approach him. Her hand tightened on her phone, her first instinct a surge of protective fear. But then she watched as the man kept his distance, as he talked, as he left, and then came back with a bag of food. She watched him place it on the bench and walk away without a backward glance. She couldn't hear their words, couldn't see their faces clearly, but she could read the universal language of the exchange. It was an act of pure, unadorned kindness. A wave of something complex and overwhelming washed over her. Gratitude, sharp and painful, for the stranger who had fed her son when she could not. And a deep, aching sadness that her son was so lost he would only accept comfort from a stranger. She ended her call abruptly, her gaze still fixed on the parking lot. Jamal was now tentatively reaching into the bag, his shoulders still hunched, but no longer a fortress. Just a boy, eating a burger on a cold night. Alana leaned her forehead against the cool glass of the window, the glittering city lights blurring into a watercolor of sorrow and hope. This new job, this new city, was supposed to be a fresh start for them. But so far, it felt like they had only brought their ghosts along for the ride. Mark pushed open the door to the daycare. The room was quiet, all the toys put away in their neat bins. In the corner, under a dim reading lamp, sat a small girl with hair the color of spun gold, carefully coloring in a picture. A young woman, a college student named Chloe, looked up from her textbook and smiled. "Hey, Mark." She was an angel, as always. Lily looked up, her blue eyes, so much like her mother's, lighting up. "Daddy." She scrambled off her chair and ran to him, wrapping her arms around his legs. He bent down and scooped her into his arms, burying his face in her hair. She smelled of crayons and apple juice, the scent of pure, uncomplicated love. It was the anchor in his storm-tossed life. "Hey, Peanut," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Sorry I'm late." "It's okay," she said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "Chloe and I were talking about stars." He held her tight, feeling the steady beat of her small heart against his chest. For a moment, the hollow room inside him felt a little less empty. As they walked back through the parking lot, he glanced over at the bench. It was empty. The Burger King bag and wrappings were gone, neatly placed inside a nearby trash can. It was a small thing, but it was something. It was a sign that somewhere beneath the anger and the pain, there was a person who had been taught to clean up after himself. It was a flicker of order in the chaos. Mark buckled Lily into her car seat, her chatter about constellations filling the small space of their aging sedan. He started the car, the engine rumbling to life. As he pulled out of the parking lot and onto the main road, he didn't know that he had just set in motion a chain of events that would irrevocably alter the course of his life. He didn't know that the boy on the bench was connected to the powerful new CEO who was, at that very moment, staring down at the same street from her glass tower. He didn't know that his simple act of buying a stranger a burger was the first stone cast into a still pond, its ripples destined to touch every shore of his carefully guarded world. He was just a tired father, a grieving husband, a dedicated nurse, driving home under a sky full of stars he was too weary to see. The next few days at Northwood General were a whirlwind of managed chaos, the kind that becomes normal in a place dedicated to cheating death. For Dr. Alana Hayes, it was a trial by fire. She moved through the hospital with a calm, decisive energy that commanded respect. She was brilliant, her mind a sharp scalpel that could cut through bureaucratic red tape and departmental squabbles with unnerving precision. She met with surgeons, administrators, and union reps, her voice even, her gaze direct. She was a black woman in a world still dominated by white men, and she knew she had no room for error. Every decision was scrutinized, every move watched. She wore her authority like a well-tailored suit, a protective layer that shielded the woman underneath. The woman who, every night, went home to a silent, sterile apartment and a son who looked at her with accusing eyes. Her conversations with Jamal were clipped and painful, minefields of unspoken resentment. "How was school?" she'd ask, her voice bright with a hope she didn't feel. "Fine," he'd grunt from behind a screen, his thumbs flying across his phone. "Did you meet anyone?" "No." "Jamal, you have to try. This is our home now." He would finally look up then, his eyes dark with a pain she couldn't seem to reach. "This is your job. It's not my home." And the conversation would die, another casualty in the Cold War between them. She knew he was grieving. His father, her ex-husband, had passed away from a sudden heart attack just a year ago. The move to a new city, for this prestigious CEO position, had been her attempt to outrun the ghost of that loss, to build something new for them. But she had only succeeded in isolating Jamal further, ripping him away from his friends, his school, his life. She was a celebrated leader who could manage a multi-million-dollar budget and a staff of thousands. But she was failing at the one job that mattered most. She was failing her son. One afternoon, seeking a moment of respite from the endless meetings, Alana took a walk through the hospital's main cafeteria. It was a bustling, noisy place, a cross-section of the hospital's ecosystem. Doctors in white coats, nurses in colorful scrubs, anxious family members, all mingling in a symphony of clattering trays and low chatter. Her eyes scanned the room, a habit of observation she couldn't turn off. And then she saw him. Her son, Jamal, was sitting alone at a small table in the corner, earbuds in, staring blankly at the wall. He was supposed to be at his new school. A cold dread washed over her. Was he skipping? Was he in some kind of trouble? She started to walk toward him, her CEO suit feeling like a costume, her heart pounding with a familiar maternal anxiety. But before she could reach him, she saw someone else approach his table. It was the nurse from the parking lot, Mark Jennings. She knew his name now. She'd made a point to discreetly look him up in the staff directory. Pediatric nurse, level 3, 12 years of service. Stellar performance reviews. Widower. One daughter, Lily, age 6. Mark was holding a cup of coffee, and he stopped by Jamal's table, not as an authority figure, but as an equal. He said something she couldn't hear. Jamal looked up, startled, and pulled out one earbud. He didn't smile, but the hard mask of his anger seemed to soften, just for a moment. He grunted a reply. Mark nodded, said something else, and then moved on, finding a seat at a different table. He didn't push. He didn't pry. He just acknowledged him. It was a small gesture, almost insignificant, but Alana saw it for what it was, a lifeline. This man, this stranger, was offering her son a sliver of connection in a world where he felt completely alone. She retreated, her heart a confused tangle of emotions. She felt a profound, humbling gratitude, and she felt a pang of something that felt dangerously like jealousy. This nurse, with his tired eyes and gentle demeanor, had reached her son in a way she couldn't. A few days later, the hospital hosted its annual Family Day, a carefully orchestrated PR event designed to boost morale. Mark usually avoided these things, the forced cheerfulness grating on his frayed nerves. But Lily had been talking about it for weeks, excited by the promise of face painting and a magic show. So he brought her in, her hand tucked securely in his. The main atrium was festooned with balloons and streamers, the air thick with the smell of popcorn and the sound of children's laughter. For a while, Mark could almost forget where he was. He watched Lily get a shimmering butterfly painted on her cheek, her face a mask of pure delight. He bought her a pink cotton candy that was bigger than her head. He felt a phantom pang of loss, the ghost of Sarah who should have been there, her laughter mingling with Lily's. But he pushed it down, focusing on the present, on the small, warm hand in his. He was so focused on Lily that he didn't notice they were being watched. Jamal had come to the hospital to meet his mother, a forced weekly ritual he despised. He was cutting through the atrium, planning to hide out in the cafeteria until she was done with her glad-handing, when he saw them. The nurse, and a little girl with hair like sunshine and a butterfly on her cheek. He stopped, hidden behind a large potted plant. He watched the man swing the little girl around, her squeals of laughter echoing in the cavernous space. He saw a look of such unguarded love on the man's face that it made something ache in his own chest. He should have kept walking. He should have disappeared back into his own world of silent anger. But he was frozen, a spectator to a scene of simple happiness that felt as foreign to him as a distant planet. Lily, in a fit of giggles, wriggled out of her father's grasp and darted away, the half-eaten cotton candy held aloft like a fluffy pink torch. Mark, laughing, started after her. Lily not so fast. But Lily, a creature of pure impulse, was drawn to the quiet corner where Jamal was hiding. She stopped right in front of him, her head cocked to one side. She wasn't scared. She didn't see a sullen, angry teenager. She just saw a boy. "Hi," she said, her voice clear and bright. Jamal was speechless. He just stared at her, this tiny, vibrant human who had breached his defenses without even trying. "You look sad," Lily stated, not as an accusation, but as a simple observation. It was the same thing her father had said, but coming from this little girl, it landed differently. It didn't feel like an intrusion. It felt like the truth. Before he could formulate a response, she did something that shattered his composure completely. She held out her free hand, which was clutching a piece of paper. "This is for you," she said. Jamal looked down. It was a crayon drawing. A lopsided, yellow sun with a wobbly smile, surrounded by a chaotic blue sky. It was simple. It was imperfect. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He reached out a hesitant hand and took it. The paper was slightly sticky from the cotton candy. "Why?" he managed to whisper, the word catching in his throat. Lily beamed, a smile that could have powered the entire hospital. "Because everyone needs a son," she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Mark finally caught up, his apology ready on his lips. "I'm so sorry, she's..." He trailed off as he saw the scene. His daughter, talking to the boy from the parking lot. And the boy, Jamal, was holding her drawing, his face a mixture of shock and wonder. The hard mask was gone, replaced by a raw, unguarded vulnerability. For the first time, Mark saw him not as a rude teen, but just as a boy. A boy who, like everyone else, just needed a little bit of sunshine. In that moment, in the middle of a noisy atrium filled with strangers, a fragile, invisible thread was woven between the three of them, a connection forged by a child's simple kindness and a lopsided crayon sun. The crayon drawing became a talisman for Jamal. He smoothed it out and stuck it on the wall above his bed in the sterile, impersonal bedroom that felt more like a hotel room than a home. It was a tiny splash of color in a sea of beige, a daily reminder that not everyone looked at him and saw a problem. The lopsided sun, with its wobbly smile, seemed to watch over him. He started to find excuses to be at the hospital. He'd tell his mom he needed to use the library for a school project or that he was meeting a friend. A lie, but a necessary one. His real purpose was to catch a glimpse of the nurse and his daughter. He learned their routine. He knew that Mark's shift usually ended around 7 p.m., and that Lily would be waiting in the after-school program near the East Wing. He would position himself in the hallway, pretending to be engrossed in his phone, and wait. The first few times, he just watched them walk by. Mark would be tired, his shoulders slumped, but his face would soften the moment he saw Lily. They would walk hand in hand to the parking garage, their conversation a low, happy murmur. Jamal felt a pang of envy so sharp it was like a physical pain. It was a window into a world he had forgotten existed, a world of simple, unconditional parental love. One evening, he worked up the courage to step out from his hiding spot as they approached. "Hey," he said, the word feeling clumsy and loud in the quiet hallway. Mark stopped, a flicker of surprise on his face, but it quickly morphed into a warm, gentle smile. Jamal, how are you doing? Lily, however, had no such reservations. Jamal, she cried, her face breaking into a huge grin. She dropped her father's hand and ran to him, stopping just short of hugging him. Did you like my son? Jamal's cheeks grew warm. He nodded, unable to find his voice. He just looked at her, this tiny beacon of light who had somehow decided he was worthy of her friendship. It's on my wall, he finally managed to say. From that day on, it became their ritual. Jamal would wait for them, and he would walk with them to their car. The conversations were stilted at first. Mark would ask about school, and Jamal would give one-word answers. But Lily was the bridge. She would chatter away, asking Jamal about his favorite video games, his favorite color, if he believed in aliens. And Jamal, to his own surprise, would answer her. He found himself telling her about the comic books he liked to draw, about the dog he'd had to leave behind when they moved. He talked to Lily in a way he couldn't talk to anyone else, his voice losing its hard, defensive edge. Mark watched these interactions with a quiet, growing sense of wonder. He saw the way Jamal's entire demeanor changed around Lily. The hunched shoulders would straighten, the sullen frown would occasionally be replaced by a small, hesitant smile. He was seeing the boy underneath the armor. He learned, through snippets of conversation, that Jamal's mother worked at the hospital. He assumed she was a secretary or maybe a lab tech, someone who worked long hours like he did. He never pressed for details, respecting the boy's privacy. It was enough that Jamal was opening up, that he was letting a little bit of light into his self-imposed darkness. One evening, as they were walking, Lily stumbled, her shoelace coming undone. Mark bent down to tie it, and Jamal instinctively put a hand on her shoulder to steady her. It was a simple, protective gesture, but it spoke volumes. When Mark stood up, he looked at Jamal, really looked at him. "Thank you," he said, and the words were for more than just the small act of kindness. They were for being a friend to his daughter, for showing up, for trying. During these weeks, the ghost of Mark's own past was a constant, silent companion. Walking these halls was a daily act of courage. This was the hospital where he had met Sarah. She had been a patient, a minor surgery that had led to a coffee date, which had led to a lifetime of love packed into far too few years. This was also the hospital where he had lost her. A sudden, aggressive infection after Lily was born. It had been swift and brutal. He remembered the frantic beeping of the machines, the hushed, grim voices of the doctors, the feeling of the world tilting off its axis. He had been a nurse in this very building, but in those moments, he had been nothing but a terrified husband, powerless to stop the inevitable. His grief had left him with a deep-seated distrust of the very system he worked for. He respected the doctors and his fellow nurses, but he hated the hierarchy, the cold, clinical detachment that could sometimes feel like indifference. He saw Dr. Alana Hayes, the new CEO, making her rounds. She was a striking figure, always impeccably dressed, her presence radiating a powerful, almost intimidating aura. He saw her as the embodiment of that system, a brilliant, untouchable figure at the top of the pyramid, far removed from the messy, human reality of the floors below. He had no idea, of course, that this powerful woman went home every night to a son who was being slowly healed by the kindness of Mark's own daughter. The two men, Mark and Jamal, were building a fragile friendship in the shadow of the institution she commanded, their lives intersecting in ways neither of them could yet comprehend. One rainy Tuesday, Mark's shift was particularly brutal. A little boy had been brought in with a severe asthma attack, his small body struggling for every breath. It hit too close to home, reminding Mark of Sarah's final, desperate moments. He worked with a fierce, focused energy, but by the time the boy was stabilized and resting, Mark was emotionally drained, a hollowed-out shell of himself. He was late, again, to pick up Lily. When he got to the daycare, he found her not with Chloe, the college student, but with Jamal. They were sitting at a small table, their heads bent together over a piece of paper. Jamal was drawing, his long, artistic fingers moving a crayon with surprising grace. He was showing Lily how to draw a dragon. Lily was watching, mesmerized, a look of pure adoration on her face. Chloe looked up and gave Mark a sheepish smile. He showed up a little while ago. Said his mom was stuck in a meeting. I hope it's okay. Lily was thrilled. It's more than okay, Mark said, his voice thick. He stood there for a moment, just watching them. The angry boy from the parking lot was gone. In his place was a patient, gentle teacher, a big brother. The sight was a balm to his raw, wounded soul. That's a really good dragon, Mark said, his voice startling them. Jamal looked up, a faint blush on his cheeks. It's nothing, he mumbled, but he couldn't hide the flicker of pride in his eyes. As they packed up to leave, Lily turned to Mark, her blue eyes wide and serious. Daddy, she said, can Jamal come over for pancakes on Saturday? The question hung in the air. It was so simple, so pure. It was a child's attempt to weave their separate worlds together. Mark looked at Jamal, whose eyes widened in surprise. He looked back at Lily, at her hopeful, expectant face. He thought of his small, quiet apartment, a place that hadn't hosted a guest in years. He thought of the silence, the ghosts, and he thought of this boy, who had been so kind to his daughter. I think, Mark said slowly, a real smile touching his lips for the first time all day. That's a great idea. The joy on Lily's face was incandescent. And on Jamal's face, there was a flicker of something that looked an awful lot like hope. The week leading up to Pancake Saturday was filled with a nervous energy that vibrated in Mark's small apartment. He cleaned with a fervor he hadn't felt in years, scrubbing floors and wiping down surfaces that hadn't been touched since Sarah was alive. He was dusting a framed photo of her on the mantelpiece, her smile radiant, her eyes full of life, when he was struck by a powerful wave of sadness. What would she think of all this? A strange, sullen boy coming for breakfast? He knew the answer instantly. She would have loved it. She would have thrown open the doors and welcomed Jamal with a hug, seeing past his defensive shell to the lonely boy within. The thought gave him strength. He was not just doing this for Lily, or even for Jamal. He was doing it for Sarah, too. He was choosing to let a little bit of life back into the quiet, sad space she had left behind. Meanwhile, Jamal was a bundle of nerves. He told his mother he was going to the library on Saturday morning, a lie that tasted like ash in his mouth. He hated lying to her, but he didn't know how to explain. How could he tell this powerful, brilliant woman who solved immense problems every day that his only friend was a 6-year-old girl, and that he was going to her house for pancakes? It felt foolish. It felt like a betrayal of the cool, indifferent persona he had so carefully constructed. He almost canceled 5 times. But the image of Lily's hopeful face and the memory of Mark's kind, non-judgmental eyes kept him from backing out. On Saturday morning, Mark was a mess of anxiety. He burned the first batch of pancakes, filling the apartment with a plume of acrid smoke. He dropped an egg on the floor. Lily, oblivious to his stress, was setting the small kitchen table with painstaking care, placing a wobbly crayon sun at Jamal's spot. At exactly 10 o'clock, there was a soft knock on the door. Mark took a deep breath and opened it. Jamal stood there, looking deeply uncomfortable in a clean, new-looking sweatshirt. He was holding a small, clumsily wrapped package. "Hi," he mumbled, not meeting Mark's eyes. "Hey, come on in," Mark said, stepping aside. "You're right on time." Lily came running from the kitchen. "Jamal, you came." She threw her arms around his waist in a fierce, welcoming hug. Jamal froze for a second, then awkwardly patted her on the back. He held out the package to Mark. "This is, for you guys," he said. Mark took it. It was a box of gourmet pancake mix. "Wow, Jamal, you didn't have to do that. Thank you." The gesture was so thoughtful, so unexpectedly formal, that it touched Mark deeply. The morning was awkward at first. The conversation was stilted, punctuated by the sizzle of pancakes on the griddle. But Lily, as always, was the social lubricant. She chattered on about her week at school, about a funny-looking dog she saw at the park, about her theory that squirrels were secret agents. Jamal started to relax. He answered her questions, and even asked a few of his own. Mark served up a stack of perfectly golden brown pancakes, and they ate at the small table, the city bustling outside the window. For the first time, Jamal saw Mark not as a nurse, but as a dad. He saw the easy, loving way he interacted with Lily, the way he cut her pancakes into small bites, the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed at her silly jokes. After breakfast, Lily dragged Jamal into the living room to show him her collection of toys. Mark watched them from the doorway, a mug of coffee warming his hands. He saw Jamal get down on the floor, his long legs folded awkwardly, and help Lily build a tower of colorful blocks. He was patient and engaged, his earlier tension completely gone. In that moment, watching them play, Mark's apartment didn't feel so quiet or so sad. It felt full. It felt like a home. Later, as Jamal was getting ready to leave, he paused at the door. "Thanks," he said, finally looking Mark in the eye. "That was cool." "Anytime," Mark replied, and he meant it. "You're always welcome here, Jamal." As Jamal walked home, the smell of pancakes still clinging to his clothes, he felt a strange sense of peace. For a few hours, he hadn't been the new kid, or the angry kid, or the CEO's son. He had just been Jamal. He had been a friend. The fragile, invisible thread that had been woven between the three of them was now stronger, thicker, reinforced by the simple, shared magic of a Saturday morning pancake breakfast. They had created a small island of normalcy in their complicated lives, a safe harbor from the storms that raged around them. But none of them knew that a storm of a different kind was gathering on the horizon, a storm that would test their fledgling bond in ways they could never imagine. The next few weeks fell into a comfortable rhythm, a quiet domesticity that was new and precious to all of them. Pancake Saturdays became a regular event. Sometimes Jamal would bring a new comic book to show Lily. Other times, Mark would teach them both a simple card game. The small apartment, once a sanctuary of grief, began to fill with the sound of laughter. Mark saw the profound effect this friendship was having on his daughter. Lily, who had been a quiet and sometimes solitary child, was blossoming. She was more confident, more outgoing. Jamal was her hero, her big brother. She would save her best drawings for him, her most exciting stories. And Mark saw the change in Jamal, too. The boy who had been a fortress of anger was slowly letting down his drawbridge. He started talking more about his own life, about his passion for art and his dream of one day designing video game characters. He even, hesitantly, talked about his dad, about how much he missed him. Mark listened, never judging, never offering easy platitudes. He just created a safe space for the boy to be himself. This newfound connection started to bleed into the rest of their lives. One sunny afternoon, Mark took Lily to the park, and they invited Jamal to come along. They threw a frisbee, its red arc a bright slash against the blue sky. They lay on the grass and looked for shapes in the clouds. For a few hours, they were just a normal, happy group of people enjoying a beautiful day. Mark felt a lightness he hadn't experienced in years. He was still grieving Sarah. He would always be grieving her, but the grief was no longer an all-consuming darkness. It was becoming a part of him he could live with, a quiet sadness that coexisted with moments of joy. He was learning that it was possible to hold both sorrow and happiness in his heart at the same time. But as their bond deepened, the secret of Jamal's mother loomed larger, an unspoken truth in the background of their friendship. Mark still assumed she was just another overworked hospital employee. He felt a sense of solidarity with this anonymous woman, another single parent trying to do their best. He had no idea that she was the powerful Dr. Hayes, the woman whose portrait now hung in the hospital lobby, a symbol of everything he found intimidating about the medical establishment. Jamal, for his part, was trapped in a web of his own making. The lie about his mother's job had started as a defense mechanism, a way to keep his two worlds separate. But now, it felt like a heavy weight. How could he tell Mark and Lily the truth? How could he explain that his mother was the CEO of the entire hospital? It seemed like a betrayal of the simple, unpretentious friendship they had built. He was afraid that if they knew, they would see him differently. They would no longer see just Jamal. They would see the CEO's son, a boy of privilege and power. And he was terrified of losing the only real friends he had. The universe, however, has a way of forcing secrets into the light. The storm that had been gathering on the horizon was about to break, and it would arrive on a perfectly ordinary Wednesday afternoon. The weather was beautiful, one of those rare, perfect autumn days where the air is crisp and the sun is warm. Mark had the day off, and he and Lily were at the same park where they had played with Jamal. Lily was chasing a butterfly, her laughter like tiny bells in the clear air. Mark was sitting on a bench, watching her, a contented smile on his face. Everything felt right. Everything felt peaceful. And then, in an instant, it wasn't. Lily suddenly stopped running. She clutched her small chest, her eyes wide with a terrifying mixture of confusion and panic. She made a small, gasping sound, like a fish pulled from water. Mark was on his feet in a second, his nurse's training kicking into high gear, but his father's heart was screaming in terror. "Lily? Peanut, what's wrong?" She couldn't answer. Her face was turning a pale, bluish color. She was struggling for breath, her small chest heaving with violent, unproductive coughs. It was an asthma attack, but it was worse than any she'd ever had before. It was severe, acute, and escalating with terrifying speed. Mark fumbled in his backpack for her emergency inhaler, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grasp it. He administered a puff, then another, but it was having no effect. The wheezing sound from her lungs was a high-pitched, desperate whistle. Panic, cold and absolute, seized him. This was his worst nightmare come to life. The ghosts of Sarah's final moments rose up to haunt him, the memory of beeping machines and helpless fear. He scooped Lily into his arms. She felt terrifyingly limp, her small body fighting a battle it was losing. He ran, faster than he had ever run in his life, toward the street, toward help, toward the one place he both worked for and feared above all others, Northwood General Hospital. The world narrowed to a tunnel of pure, primal terror. The only thing that mattered was the fading, ragged sound of his daughter's breathing. The emergency room at Northwood General was a controlled storm of activity, a place Mark knew intimately from a professional distance. But crashing through its doors with his own child, limp and blue-tinged in his arms, was a terrifying, disorienting nightmare. "I need help," he yelled, his voice cracking with a panic he couldn't control. "My daughter, she's not breathing." The well-oiled machine of the ER sprang into action. A team of nurses and doctors swarmed them, whisking Lily from his arms and onto a gurney. They were a blur of blue scrubs and focused, urgent faces. They shouted medical terms he knew all too well. Severe respiratory distress. Sats are dropping. Get me a pediatric crash cart. But hearing them applied to his own child made them sound like a foreign, terrifying language. Mark was pushed to the side, out of the way. He was no longer Nurse Jennings, a competent and respected colleague. He was just a father, helpless and terrified, watching his entire world fight for breath under the harsh, unforgiving glare of the trauma bay lights. He felt a hand on his shoulder and looked up to see one of the ER doctors, a man he'd shared coffee with 100 times. "Mark, we've got her. We're intubating now. What happened?" Mark's mind was a chaotic jumble. He tried to give a clinical history, to be the good nurse, the helpful professional. "Asthma. She has asthma. We were at the park. Maybe an allergen, a bee sting, I don't know." But his voice broke, and he buried his face in his hands, the sounds of the medical team working on his daughter a symphony of his deepest fears. Time became a thick, syrupy substance. Minutes stretched into agonizing eternities. Finally, the doctor returned. "We've stabilized her, Mark. She's intubated, and we're moving her up to the PICU. She's not out of the woods, but she's fighting." The pediatric intensive care unit. The PICU. It was the floor right next to his own, a place he tried never to think about, a place for the sickest of the sick children. The walk there was the longest of his life. He saw the faces of his colleagues, their expressions a mixture of sympathy and professional concern. They saw him not as Mark, their friend, but as the father of the patient in bed 4. He sat in a cold, plastic chair in the waiting room outside the PICU, the rhythmic, mechanical sound of the ventilator breathing for his daughter echoing in his ears. The hollow room in his heart was no longer just empty. It was a vast, terrifying abyss. He felt utterly and completely alone. News travels fast in a hospital. The story of a veteran nurse's daughter being rushed to the PICU spread through the floors like a virus. It was a tragedy that touched everyone, a reminder of their shared vulnerability. The news eventually reached the 10th floor, the pristine, quiet world of the executive suite. Dr. Alana Hayes was in a tense budget meeting when her assistant interrupted, her face grim. "Dr. Hayes, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's an emergency in the PICU. A staff member's child." Alana felt the familiar shift from administrator to leader. "Whose child?" "A nurse, Mark Jennings. His 6-year-old daughter, Lily. It was a sudden, severe asthma attack. They're saying it's critical." The name hit Alana like a physical blow. Mark Jennings, the kind nurse from the parking lot, the man whose home her son had just visited. And Lily, the little girl with the sunshine hair and the crayon drawing. The little girl who was her son's only friend. A cold dread, sharp and personal, cut through her professional composure. This wasn't just a staff member's child. This was Lily. At the same time, across town, Jamal was trying to call Lily's phone, a cheap Payugo model Mark had gotten her for emergencies. He wanted to tell her about a new character he had designed, a warrior princess who looked a lot like her. But she didn't answer. He tried Mark's phone. No answer. A knot of anxiety began to tighten in his stomach. Something felt wrong. He called his mother's office, a last resort. "Mom, have you seen Mark or Lily? They're not answering their phones." Alana's voice was strained, tight with an emotion he couldn't place. "Jamal, there's been an incident. Lily's been brought to the hospital. She's in the PICU." The world tilted on its axis. The PICU. He knew what that meant. He didn't even say goodbye. He hung up the phone, grabbed his jacket, and ran out the door, his heart pounding a frantic, terrified rhythm against his ribs. He had to get to her. He had to get to the hospital. The two threads of their separate lives, one of power and prestige, the other of quiet, desperate fear, were now racing toward the same destination, destined to finally, irrevocably, collide. The PICU waiting room was a small, sterile purgatory, a place where time was measured in the beat of a heart monitor and the whisper of a ventilator. Mark sat hunched in a chair, his head in his hands, the world reduced to the sterile smell of the hospital and the crushing weight of his own fear. He was lost in a fog of grief and memory, the ghosts of his wife's final days swirling around him. He felt a presence beside him and looked up, expecting a nurse or a doctor with an update. Instead, he saw Jamal. The boy's face was pale, his eyes wide with a terror that mirrored his own. He was breathing hard, as if he had run the whole way here. He didn't say anything. He just sank into the chair next to Mark, a silent, trembling pillar of support. Mark was too exhausted, too broken, to even question how he knew. He was just grateful, in a distant, numb way, not to be completely alone. A few minutes later, the double doors to the waiting room swished open. Mark looked up, his heart lurching, praying for good news. But it wasn't a doctor. It was Dr. Alana Hayes. She stood there in her immaculate designer suit, her face a mask of controlled, professional concern. She was the CEO, the embodiment of the powerful, untouchable system that now held his daughter's life in its hands. "Mr. Jennings," she began, her voice calm and measured. "I was so sorry to hear about your daughter. I want to assure you that she is getting the absolute best care." Mark barely heard her words. He just stared at this woman, this symbol of the cold, impersonal institution he so deeply distrusted. A wave of irrational anger washed over him. But then, Alana's gaze shifted. It moved past Mark and landed on the boy slouched in the chair beside him. Her professional mask shattered. Her eyes widened, and her mouth fell slightly open. All the air seemed to leave the room. "Jamal?" She whispered, the name a breath of pure shock. Mark's head whipped around. He looked at the powerful, formidable CEO, and then at the sullen, frightened teenager by his side. And in that one, heart-stopping instant, the impossible, unthinkable truth crashed down on him. The boy on the bench. The boy who ate pancakes in his kitchen. The boy who was his daughter's best friend. He was the son of Dr. Alana Hayes. The world seemed to spin, the carefully constructed walls between his different worlds crumbling into dust. The kind nurse who bought a hungry kid a burger. The powerful CEO who ran the hospital. The angry boy on the bench. The innocent girl in the hospital bed. They were all connected, their lives tangled together in a knot of secrets and kindness, tragedy and hope. Alana took a hesitant step forward, her eyes locked on her son. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Jamal finally looked up, his face a mixture of guilt and defiance. "Lily's my friend," he said, the words simple, powerful, and absolute. He looked at Mark, then back at his mother. "He's my friend, too." Alana stared at them, at the exhausted, grieving nurse and her own lost, lonely son, sitting side by side in a hospital waiting room, united by their love for a little girl fighting for her life. The CEO facade dissolved completely, washed away by a tidal wave of emotion. She was no longer Dr. Hayes, the hospital administrator. She was just Alana, a mother, a woman who had been so focused on building a new life that she hadn't seen the beautiful, fragile thing her son had been building right under her nose. She looked at Mark, really looked at him for the first time, not as an employee, but as a fellow parent. She saw the raw pain in his eyes, the deep, soul-crushing fear that she, as a mother, understood completely. She remembered the man in the parking lot, the man who had shown her son a kindness she had been unable to give, and she finally understood the depth of her debt to him. The silence in the room was thick with unspoken truths, with regret and revelation. The three of them stood on the precipice of a new reality, their old world shattered, their futures uncertain, bound together by the steady, rhythmic beep of a machine that was breathing for a little girl named Lily. The sterile, tense atmosphere of the waiting room became a crucible, melting away years of armor and pretense. Alana sank into the chair on the other side of Mark, the designer suit suddenly feeling like a ridiculous costume. She was no longer the imposing CEO. She was a mother, terrified for her son, and heartbroken for this man she barely knew but to whom she owed an immeasurable debt. "I didn't know," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He never told me." Mark looked at her, his anger replaced by a profound weariness. "He's a good kid, Dr. Hayes." "Please," she said, her eyes pleading. "Call me Alana." The use of her first name was a white flag, an offering of truce and vulnerability. "He told me about you," she continued, her gaze shifting to her son, who was still staring at the floor. "He called me from the park. He was frantic. He just kept saying, 'Lily's sick, Mom. Lily's sick.'" A tear escaped her eye and traced a path down her cheek. She wiped it away impatiently. "Thank you," she said, turning back to Mark. "For everything. For the Burger King. For the pancakes. For being his friend when I couldn't." The confession hung in the air, raw and painful. It was an admission of failure from a woman who was celebrated for her success. Mark felt a crack in the wall around his own heart. He saw not a powerful executive, but a fellow single parent, struggling and flawed, and trying her best. The shared terror of their situation had made them equals. "She loves him," Mark said, his voice thick with emotion as he thought of Lily. "He's her best friend. Her big brother." He finally allowed himself to break, the dam of his composure giving way. A dry, rag sob escaped his lips. "I can't lose her, Alana. She's all I have left." Without thinking, Alana reached out and placed her hand on his arm. It was a simple gesture of human comfort, a touch that crossed the vast chasm between their professional roles. "You won't," she said, her voice full of a conviction she didn't entirely feel but desperately needed to project. "This is a good hospital. These are the best doctors. We will not let you lose her." Jamal, who had been a silent observer to this raw, emotional exchange, finally looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed. He looked at his mother, at the tears on her face, and at Mark, a man he respected, now completely broken. The weight of his own anger and resentment seemed to lift, replaced by a deep, aching empathy. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered. "I should have told you." Alana turned to him, her expression softening. "It's okay, baby. I'm sorry too. I've been so focused on this job. I haven't been here for you. I haven't been listening." Just then, a doctor entered the waiting room, her face tired but calm. All three of them shot to their feet, their hearts in their throats. "Mr. Jennings," the doctor said, her voice gentle. "Lily is responding to the treatment. Her vitals are stabilizing. The next 12 hours are critical, but the worst is over. She's a fighter." A collective, shuddering sigh of relief filled the room. The tension that had been holding them all rigid seemed to dissipate, leaving them weak and trembling in its wake. Mark leaned against the wall, his legs threatening to give out. Alana put an arm around Jamal, pulling him into a hug he didn't resist. For the first time in over a year, he leaned into his mother's embrace, a silent acknowledgement of their shared fear and love. In that moment, they were not a CEO, a nurse, and a troubled teen. They were just three people, bound together by a shared crisis, their lives now inextricably linked. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape that was forever changed. They had weathered it together, and in the wreckage, they had found something unexpected, the foundation of a new kind of family. The days that followed were a slow, steady climb back toward the light. Lily remained in the PICU, a tiny, resilient warrior surrounded by a web of tubes and wires. But with each passing hour, she grew stronger. The rhythmic whoosh of the ventilator was replaced by the soft, miraculous sound of her own breathing. Mark never left her side. He sat by her bed, holding her hand, reading her favorite stories, his voice a low, constant murmur of love and encouragement. But he was no longer alone in his vigil. Alana and Jamal became a constant presence. Alana, using her authority as CEO, bent every rule. She had a comfortable cot brought in for Mark. She made sure he had meals, coffee, anything he needed. She moved her meetings, took calls from the hallway, effectively running the entire hospital from the small, tense world of the PICU. She did it not as a boss, but as a friend. She would sit with Mark for hours, talking quietly about everything and nothing, about their children, their pasts, their hopes for the future. He learned about her ambitious journey from a humble background to the pinnacle of her profession. He learned about her difficult marriage and the painful void her ex-husband's death had left, not just for Jamal, but for her as well. She learned about Sarah. Mark, for the first time in years, spoke of his late wife to someone other than Lily. He told Alana about her laughter, her kindness, her reckless empathy. He spoke of the crushing weight of his grief and the fear that he would never truly be whole again. In sharing their broken pieces, they found a strange and unexpected comfort. They saw their own loneliness reflected in each other's eyes. Jamal, meanwhile, devoted himself to Lily. He would arrive after school every day, his backpack full of new drawings and comic books. He would sit by her bed, even when she was sleeping, and tell her about his day. He described the characters he was designing for his imaginary video game, giving them names and backstories. He was building a world for her to step into when she was ready. When Lily finally woke up, groggy and confused, the first word she whispered was Jamal. He was right there, his face breaking into a smile, so bright it seemed to light up the entire room. "Hey, sleepyhead," he said softly. "I've got a new story for you." From that moment on, her recovery was rapid. Her first real meal was a bowl of ice cream, shared with a spoon by a triumphant Jamal. Her first steps down the hospital corridor were taken with Mark on one side and Jamal on the other, a wobbly but determined procession of hope. The hospital staff watched the unfolding drama with a quiet sense of awe. They saw their powerful, intimidating CEO sitting on the floor with a coloring book. They saw the sullen, angry teenager who used to haunt the cafeteria now patiently explaining the rules of a card game to a 6-year-old girl. They saw their colleague, Mark, a man they knew had been drowning in grief, slowly, tentatively, begin to smile again. The invisible walls of hierarchy and role had crumbled, replaced by the simple, undeniable power of human connection. The day Lily was discharged was a celebration. The nurses on her floor threw a small party with balloons and a cake that said, "Welcome home, Lily." As Mark pushed her wheelchair through the hospital's main doors and out into the bright sunshine, he felt like he was breathing fresh air for the first time in a very long time. Alana and Jamal were there, waiting for them. There were no reporters, no official hospital business. It was just them. "Ready to go home, Peanut?" Mark asked, his voice thick with unshed tears of gratitude. Lily nodded, her face beaming. Then she looked at Alana and Jamal. "Are you coming too?" she asked, her question simple and profound. Alana and Mark exchanged a look, a silent conversation passing between them. It was a look of understanding, of shared history, of a future that was suddenly, unexpectedly, full of possibility. "We wouldn't miss it for the world," Alana said, her voice soft. And as they all walked toward the car, a strange and wonderful new configuration of a family, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. The weeks after Lily's homecoming were a period of gentle, deliberate healing. The four of them began to weave their lives together, not with grand gestures, but with the small, everyday threads of shared experience. Their first pancake Saturday back at Mark's apartment was a joyous, chaotic affair. Jamal, now a confident co-chef, was in charge of flipping, while Lily, perched on a stool, acted as official taste tester. Alana, initially hesitant and out of place in the tiny, humble kitchen, soon found herself laughing as Mark tried to teach her how to whip cream without splattering it all over the walls. The apartment, which had once been a quiet shrine to a painful past, was now filled with the sounds of life, with laughter, with the sizzle of batter, with the happy, off-key singing of a 6-year-old girl. They went to the park, the same park where Lily had gotten sick. There was a moment of shared, unspoken fear as they entered, a collective memory of the terror of that day. But Lily, a creature of the present, broke the spell. She grabbed Jamal's hand and pulled him toward the swings, her laughter chasing away the ghosts. Mark and Alana sat on a bench, watching them. The silence between them was no longer awkward. It was comfortable, companionable. "I never thought I'd feel happy in this park again," Mark said quietly, his eyes on his daughter as she soared toward the sky. "She's teaching us how to heal," Alana replied, her gaze soft. "They both are." She looked at her son, pushing Lily on the swing, his earlier sullenness replaced by a gentle, protective focus. "You know," she said, "for months, I was trying to solve the problem of Jamal. I read parenting books, I talked to therapists, I tried to strategize my way to a solution, like he was a corporate merger." She shook her head, a small, self-deprecating smile on her lips. "And all he needed was a friend. All he needed was a pancake breakfast. All he needed was someone to see him." Mark nodded, understanding completely. "I spent years building walls around my heart to protect myself from getting hurt again," he confessed. "And a little girl with a crayon drawing and a teenage boy who needed a burger just walked right through them like they weren't even there. They were two people from vastly different worlds. He was a nurse in worn-out sneakers. She was a CEO in designer shoes. His life was a quiet struggle. Hers was a public success. But in the crucible of crisis, they had discovered a shared humanity that transcended all of those external markers. They were both just parents who loved their children. Two lonely souls who had found an unexpected harbor in each other. The culmination of this new beginning came on a crisp, sunny Saturday a month later. Alana had invited them all for a picnic at a beautiful botanical garden on the outskirts of the city. She had packed a huge basket, not with fancy, catered food, but with sandwiches she had made herself, along with Jamal's favorite chips and Lily's favorite cookies. They spread a blanket on a grassy lawn, surrounded by the vibrant colors of autumn flowers. They ate and laughed, and for the first time, it didn't feel like two separate families trying to merge. It just felt like one. After lunch, Jamal and Lily ran off to explore a nearby stream, their excited voices fading into the distance. Mark and Alana were left alone on the blanket, the warm sun on their faces. "Thank you for this," Mark said, gesturing to the peaceful scene around them. "For all of it." Alana smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that reached her eyes. "I should be thanking you, Mark." There was a pause, a moment of comfortable silence. Then, Alana spoke again, her voice softer. "I was so lost when I came to this city, so focused on my career, on proving myself, that I was losing the most important thing in my life. You and Lily, you gave me my son back. You gave me my heart back." Mark looked at her, at this incredible, strong, vulnerable woman, and felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the sun. He thought of the hollow room inside him, the one he had lived in for so long. It wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with new memories, new hopes, new light. A lopsided crayon sun, the smell of pancakes, the sound of his daughter's laughter mingling with the deeper tones of a teenage boy's. It was the sound of a found family. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know if this was just a beautiful chapter or the beginning of a whole new story. But as he sat there, on a blanket in the sun, next to a woman he was beginning to care for deeply, watching their children play together, he knew one thing for certain. He was no longer alone. And that was more than enough. The story of Mark, Alana, Lily, and Jamal isn't just a tale of chance encounters and hospital emergencies. It's a powerful reminder that the families we make can be just as strong as the families we are born into. It shows us that beneath the surface of our job titles, our backgrounds, and the walls we build around ourselves, we are all just people, searching for connection, kindness, and a place to belong. Their journey teaches us to look past the angry teenager on the bench, to see the lonely boy inside. It reminds us that a simple act of kindness, like buying a stranger a burger, can set in motion ripples of change that transform lives in ways we can never predict. It proves that even in our darkest moments of fear and grief, the love of a child and the empathy of a friend can be the light that guides us home. So we ask you, have you ever misjudged someone based on their appearance or attitude? Have you ever been surprised by the kindness of a stranger? Share your stories in the comments below, because every story of connection makes the world a little bit warmer. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, share it with someone who needs a little hope, And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspirational stories that remind us of the good in the world. Thank you for watching.